At 10:03 on a Friday morning, our financial planner turned her monitor toward us and asked why my husband's healthcare power of attorney named a woman I had never heard of. The name on the estate summary was Lila Morrow. My husband, Paul, was sitting beside me. He did not ask who she was. He reached for the printed packet and said the entry had to be old. Denise Hart, our planner for 11 years, kept her hand on the page. The directive was notarized last October, she said. I received the updated summary from Paul's estate attorney 3 days ago. Paul and I had been married for 26 years. I was Margaret Ellis, 52, and managed operations for a county library system outside St. Louis. Paul was 54 and supervised civil engineering projects for water systems across Missouri and southern Illinois. We had chosen not to have children, and our practical life was almost aggressively organized. Denise held our retirement projections, insurance summaries, and the plan for paying off our house within 4 years. Until she said Lila's name, I believed she also held the same future Paul and I discussed at our kitchen table. I asked what the directive authorized. Denise said she was not our attorney and could not interpret it, but her summary identified Lila as Paul's primary agent for medical decisions if he could not make them himself. Paul's older brother, Stephen, was the alternate. I was not listed. Paul said Lila had worked on a museum expansion his firm completed years earlier. She lived closer to several of his project sites, and he had chosen her temporarily when I was busy helping my sister after surgery. My sister Ruth had undergone shoulder surgery 2 years earlier. I had driven her to one appointment and brought groceries twice. I had not been unavailable in October. On the date printed beside the notarization, Paul and I had eaten dinner at home and compared hotels for our anniversary trip. Denise asked whether we wanted to pause the financial review. Paul said no too quickly. He wanted to discuss pension elections as if an unfamiliar woman had not just appeared between the words health and care. I closed my folder. What medical condition made you update a directive? I asked. Nothing made me. Then why did you? It's standard planning, Margaret. Denise looked down at her notes. I knew enough about professional discretion to recognize when someone was giving us room without pretending not to hear. I told her we would reschedule after we had reviewed the source documents. She printed the one-page summary already included in our joint planning file and wrote the attorney's office number on a sticky note. She did not give me Paul's private directive or speculate about Lila. In the parking lot, Paul said I had embarrassed him. I asked whether Lila knew more about his health than I did. He said she knew nothing because there was nothing to know. Then his right thumb began tapping against his car key. I had noticed that movement for almost a year. Paul called it a harmless essential tremor aggravated by caffeine. He said his primary care doctor was not concerned. When I reached for his hand, he put the key in his pocket. Lila was available to witness paperwork, he said. That's all. Witnesses don't become healthcare agents by accident. He told me we would talk at home and drove away before I reached my car. I did not follow him. I sat behind the steering wheel and read the summary again. The beneficiary section still named me for Paul's retirement account and life insurance. The property plan still treated our house as jointly owned. Only the person authorized to speak when Paul could not speak for himself had changed. The choice was not financial. It was intimate. At home, Paul was in his office with the door shut. I waited until he came out, then asked for 3 facts: whether Lila knew about the directive, whether she knew about his tremor, and whether their relationship was romantic. He answered the first 2 yes and the third no. He said Lila was a close friend who understood medical systems because she had cared for her father through a long illness. I asked what illness he expected her to understand for him. Paul looked toward the hallway instead of at me. I have early-stage Parkinson's, he said. For a few seconds, the diagnosis displaced Lila completely. I asked when he learned. 19 months earlier. I asked which neurologist he saw, what treatment he had started, and why he had told me the tremor was benign. Paul said the diagnosis was not fully certain at first and he did not want to make me live inside a possibility. It had since been confirmed. He was taking medication, doing prescribed exercise, and still working without restrictions. His speech and balance were unaffected. He said many people lived well for years with symptoms no one else noticed. The information came out smoothly, like an update he had practiced for someone who already knew the first 18 chapters. I sat at the dining table because my niece felt unreliable. Was Lila at the first appointment? She was nearby. Was she in the room? Yes. And the appointment after that? Paul said she had attended several. He insisted that choosing her as agent was practical. She lived 40 minutes from his neurologist, while our house was nearly 2 hours away. I reminded him that he had chosen the neurologist near her, not the other way around. He said the specialist came highly recommended by a project client. I asked why I had never been invited to one appointment. He said I worried, researched too much, and turned uncertainty into a plan before he was ready. You made a plan, I said. It just didn't include me. Paul called that unfair. He said he had protected our normal life while he learned what the diagnosis meant. I asked whether protecting our marriage required lying about the doctor, the medication, and the woman empowered to make decisions for him. He returned to the phrase close friend. When I asked to see the directive, he said it was personal. I told him his medical choices were his, but the truthfulness of our marriage belonged to me too. I would not enter his email, medical portal, or attorney files. I also would not accept a summary designed to end the conversation. Paul packed a small bag and said he needed one night at a hotel to think. His engineering firm had no weekend projects scheduled. Before he left, I asked whether he was going to Lila. He said, I'm not going to make this worse. It was an answer about consequences, not destination. After the garage door closed, I called Ruth. She taught accounting at a community college and had known Paul since our third date. I told her about the directive and the diagnosis before I mentioned the possibility of an affair. Ruth came over with a notebook and asked what information I already had a right to see. The summary Denise had printed was in our shared planning portal, uploaded 3 days earlier. Our joint credit card records showed 6 charges over 19 months to a parking garage attached to the medical center Paul had named. Each fell on a weekday he had marked as a project visit in Colombia. The charges were small and had never looked unusual among fuel, meals, and contractor parking. There were also recurring charges from a pharmacy near Paul's office, all consistent with ordinary prescriptions. Nothing showed Lila's name. Our shared calendar held entries labeled North Site Review on the same 6 dates. The work trips may have been real, the medical appointments had been fitted beside them. I searched public sources for Lila Morrow. She was 49 and worked as a museum registrar in Columbia, Missouri. Her professional biography listed collections work, exhibition loans, and the expansion Paul's firm had helped complete 6 years earlier. There were no public couple photographs, no alternate surname, and no claim that she was married. A local Parkinson's Foundation newsletter from 8 months earlier thanked Lila Morrow for organizing a small caregiver resource table. It did not name the person she supported. That was enough public information. I saved the pages and stopped. At 7:26, Paul texted that he was safe and would return Saturday afternoon. He said he had told Lila that I saw her name because she might be contacted by Denise or the attorney. I replied that I would not seek confidential medical information from either office. I would ask Lila only about her relationship with my husband if she chose to speak. At 8:14, an email arrived from Lila's personal address. She wrote that Paul had warned her I might misunderstand a medical arrangement. The first paragraph called the directive a private decision made during a frightening year. The second said she would answer factual questions if I agreed not to contact her employer or appear at her home. The final line removed the last useful ambiguity Paul had left me: the directive is not temporary, Margaret, and I have been Paul's partner for 6 years. I accepted Lila's conditions because I had no interest in her workplace or home. I added one of my own: we would speak once, by video, with Ruth in the room and no medical records that Paul had not authorized her to share. Lila agreed to Saturday at 9. She appeared on screen from a plain dining room with a closed blue binder beside her laptop. She had gray at her temples, no wedding ring, and none of the shock I had heard from other women who discovered that a partner was married. Lila already knew. Paul told her on their third dinner 6 years earlier that he had a wife in St. Louis. He said our marriage had become companionate, that we slept separately, and that we had quietly agreed not to ask about relationships outside the house. We had never made such an agreement. We had shared a bedroom until the night before. Lila did not ask to see proof because, as she put it, adults in long marriages often created arrangements other people would not understand. Their relationship became sexual 5.5 years earlier and remained current. She did not apologize for believing him. She said Paul was responsible for representing his marriage accurately, and she had chosen not to make my consent a condition of her own involvement. The distinction was honest, if not comforting. Their time together fit inside the same geography as Paul's work. He inspected pump stations and treatment plants near Columbia, then stayed at Lila's apartment instead of the hotel listed on his original itinerary. When a project ended early, he kept the return date he had given me and used the extra night with her. They took 4 personal weekends in 6 years, each attached to a real engineering conference or museum shipment, so neither required a separate explanation at home. Lila had met Stephen twice and one of Paul's retired co-workers, both of whom were told only that she was a friend from the museum project. She had not met the rest of his family. Paul never appeared on her public social pages and did not leave clothes in her main closet. It was not a complete second household but a protected corridor between work sites, her apartment, and a private version of his health. It survived because repeated trips looked legitimate when most of each trip was legitimate. I asked when she learned about Parkinson's. She attended the first neurology appointment 19 months earlier. Paul had experienced a persistent right-hand tremor and reduced arm swing during a museum site walk. Lila urged him to see a specialist and found a clinic near Columbia with an opening. Paul told her he would inform me after testing. When the diagnosis became likely, he said I had a history of severe medical anxiety and had asked him not to bring uncertain health information home. I had no such history. I managed building emergencies, workers' compensation files, and public safety plans for 9 library branches. I disliked uncertainty, but I did not collapse under it. Lila knew Paul still lived with me. She also knew that I believed his tremor was benign. You understood that I did not know, I said. Lila took several seconds before answering. Yes. And you went to the appointments anyway. He asked me to. That explains your action. It doesn't excuse it. She said she was not asking for an excuse. She believed a competent adult had the right to choose who received his medical information. I agreed that Paul controlled his diagnosis. I also said he did not control whether I remained in a marriage whose facts had been withheld from me. Ruth did not interrupt. She wrote dates while Lila described the system that had grown around the diagnosis. Paul scheduled appointments beside legitimate project visits. He kept a change of clothes and a medication organizer at Lila's apartment, but he did not live there or contribute to her mortgage. They used a shared calendar for neurology visits, physical therapy, exercise classes, and weekends together. Lila kept the blue binder. It contained the medication list Paul gave her, appointment summaries he chose to print, exercise goals, insurance contacts, the directive, and a page of questions for future specialists. She turned the binder so I could read its label, Paul, Care. My house held 26 years of tax returns, appliance warranties, photographs, and emergency numbers. The information about the body Paul would bring into our future lived in a blue binder on another woman's table. Lila said the arrangement was not about replacing me. She had cared for her father through 4 years of progressive illness and understood what planning could prevent. Paul trusted her not to turn every symptom into a crisis. I asked whether she expected to become his full-time partner if his condition progressed. She said yes. Paul told her he would speak to me when his symptoms became visible enough that concealment was no longer practical. After that, he planned to separate and move closer to Columbia. There was no signed lease, joint property, or fixed date. Lila admitted she had pushed for one. Paul always answered that a decision made during a stable period would feel cruel, while a later medical change would give everyone a reason that was easier to explain. That sentence showed me how he used the diagnosis. He did not see illness only as something to hide. He also saw it as a future explanation that could absorb blame for leaving. I asked about money. Lila and Paul had no joint account, debt, insurance, or property. He paid for his own treatment, meals, and travel. She sometimes paid for hotels or tickets, and he sometimes bought groceries for her apartment. The blue binder listed my insurance only as historical coverage from before Paul's employer changed plans. He currently had coverage through his own firm. No one had used my signature or filed a claim in my name. The financial facts removed one category of danger without changing the relationship. I asked what Paul had told her about Denise's planning meeting. He did not expect the directive to appear. His estate attorney had updated a document index and sent it to Denise because she coordinated our retirement review. Paul believed the attorney would transmit only asset information. Lila's name appeared because one administrative system had truthfully updated another. I asked Lila why she had agreed to become his agent instead of telling him to disclose the diagnosis to his wife. She said she loved him. She also said she had watched her father receive aggressive treatment he did not want because family members could not accept decline. Paul had clear preferences, and she believed she could enforce them. I did not argue with the importance of those preferences. I asked why respecting his autonomy required helping him erase mine. Lila looked at the binder. It didn't, she said. That was the first answer she gave that did not arrive with a defense attached. She offered to send a factual timeline, the expense split for trips, and the directive pages Paul had already given her permission to hold. She would not send clinical notes, test results, or messages unrelated to decisions I had to make. I accepted those limits. Before we ended, I asked whether Paul had told her what happened if he lost capacity before informing me. Lila opened the binder and removed a sealed envelope. Paul had written letters for both of us when he signed the directive. Lila had read hers. Mine was stored behind it, still sealed. He told her to deliver it only if a medical emergency made him unable to explain. I asked her not to open or send my letter. If Paul wanted me to read it, he could hand it to me while he was capable of answering questions. At 9:47, Lila emailed the bounded documents. Her timeline matched the appointment parking charges and work trips. The directive carried Paul's signature and notarial acknowledgement and named her primary agent, with Stephen as alternate. An attached instruction stated that Lila's authority remained in place even if I was present. It asked clinicians to provide me general condition updates when appropriate but directed that treatment decisions be discussed with Lila first. The page did not accidentally omit a wife. It anticipated me and moved me outside the decision. The final document was a note Paul had written to Lila after signing. Most of it concerned medications and his fear of losing independence. Near the end he wrote, "Margaret knows the life we built. You know the life I'm heading into. I need both to stay intact until I can't keep them separate." That was when the two secrets became one. Paul had not hidden an affair on one side and an illness on the other. He had assigned each woman a different version of his future, then made my ignorance the wall that allowed both versions to exist. Paul returned at 2:18 on Saturday afternoon. Ruth was still with me, and the blue estate summary, Lila's timeline, and Paul's note were arranged on the dining table. He saw the documents and asked what Lila had sent. I told him she had limited the disclosure to facts about the relationship and papers he had already authorized her to hold. His face changed when he read the line from his note. He said Lila had no right to give me something written during a private medical crisis. I said privacy was not the same as secrecy enforced through lies, then slid Lila's timeline toward him. "Is the affair still current?" Paul glanced at Ruth. "Does she need to hear this?" "She stays." He looked back at the dates. "Yes." "Did Lila know we were married and living together?" "Yes." "Did you tell her we had agreed to outside relationships?" "I told her we were independent." "Did we agree?" He let out a breath and said no. When I asked whether he planned to leave once his symptoms became visible, Paul said he did not know. Lila wanted a future with him, but he had never signed a lease, set a date, or promised that I would receive divorce papers. "You told her a medical change would make leaving easier to explain," I said. "I was trying to imagine every outcome." "No. You were trying to postpone every outcome." He sat across from me, rubbing his right thumb against the side of his index finger. This time he did not hide the movement. He said the tremor began 2 years earlier and terrified him. His father had spent the last 3 years of his life dependent on other people after a series of strokes. Paul remembered relatives discussing him in the room as if his opinions had already become symptoms. When the neurologist used the word Parkinson's, Paul pictured losing work, driving, speech, and the right to decide what happened to his own body. Lila had sat beside him without taking notes or asking for a 5-year plan. I understood why that felt like relief. I did not understand why he believed relief required a 6-year affair or a false marriage arrangement. Paul said the affair came first and the diagnosis changed its importance. Before, Lila had been a place outside ordinary obligations. After, she became the person with whom he could be frightened without feeling observed. At home, he wanted one place where the diagnosis did not exist. You let it exist here, I said, pointing to my own body. I saw your hand. I asked questions. You made me doubt what I saw so you could feel normal. Paul said he had spared me 19 months of fear. I asked whether those months belonged to him alone. If I had known, I could have chosen how to live them, what questions to ask, whether to travel sooner, whether to adjust our retirement plan, and whether I wanted to remain his wife after learning about Lila. He had not spared me fear. He had spent my time without permission. Paul reached into his bag and placed a sealed envelope on the table. My name was written across the front. It was the letter Lila had kept behind hers. He said it explained the diagnosis, his care preferences, and why he chose her. I pushed it back. Say it while you can answer me. He told me that if he lost capacity, he wanted to remain at home as long as safely possible, avoid interventions that prolonged dying without awareness, and let an agent who knew his wishes make decisions without a family vote. Those preferences were reasonable. Choosing Lila was legally his decision. Hiding the decision while promising me a shared retirement was the betrayal. Paul offered to revoke the directive immediately and name me. I said no. An agent needed to know the person's wishes, accept the burden freely, and be trusted by the patient. I had been denied the first, was being pressured into the second, and no longer possessed the third. Changing one name on Saturday would repair the appearance Denise had seen, not the marriage underneath it. Paul asked what he was supposed to do if Lila withdrew. I reminded him that Stephen was already alternate and that Paul was competent to make a new plan with his attorney and clinicians. His care remained important. It did not automatically become my assignment because the secret arrangement had failed. That boundary angered him more than the accusation of adultery. He said I was treating him like a liability at the moment he needed stability. Ruth spoke for the first time. Margaret learned yesterday that you were sick, she said. She also learned you built 6 years of intimacy somewhere else. You don't get to call the speed of her response abandonment. Paul said this was between us. I told Ruth she could stay. Then I asked Paul whether he believed I was leaving because of Parkinson's. He said he could not separate the timing. I said the timing had been chosen by the updated document, not by me. If Denise had never seen Lila's name, Paul intended to keep me uninformed until his body made the lie inconvenient. That was not a marriage protected from illness. It was a marriage denied the facts required for consent. At 4:06, Lila emailed both of us. She wrote that she had submitted a signed resignation as healthcare agent and would have no contact with Paul for 30 days while she decided whether the relationship could continue. She would return the binder and original documents directly to Paul's attorney, not leave them at his hotel or my house. She acknowledged that respecting Paul's medical privacy had become an excuse for participating in a deception she understood. She did not call the pause forgiveness or ask me for any. Paul read the email and immediately tried to call. Lila did not answer. He accused me of turning one planning error into a crisis that cost him his only prepared care partner. I said the directive was not an error, the affair was not planning, and Lila had made her own decision. I would not manage her back into the role. Paul stayed with Stephen that night. Before he left, I asked Stephen to call me privately. Paul had not told his brother about the diagnosis even though he had named him alternate agent. Stephen knew about Lila only as someone from the museum project. He was stunned by both facts. I gave him Paul's neurologist's office number from the documents Paul had shown us and told him to confirm directly with Paul what role he was willing to accept. I did not send clinical details or the affair timeline. The brothers needed their own informed conversation. On Monday, I met with a family law attorney named Carmen Reed. She told me not to confuse the healthcare directive with control over marital assets. It gave Lila medical authority under defined conditions, not access to our house, bank accounts, or Paul's retirement plan. We would verify finances separately if I chose to file. Carmen advised me to preserve shared records, avoid public accusations, and make no changes to Paul's medical documents. I redirected my paycheck to an individual account, left joint funds for ordinary bills, and changed passwords only on my personal email and work-related services. Health screening found no infection, with follow-up completed on the clinic schedule. Paul's attorney prepared a new directive naming Stephen as primary agent after Stephen agreed and met with Paul's doctor. Lila returned the binder. No one asked me to store it. Paul also provided statements for the separate checking account he used for travel reimbursements. A limited review showed about $13,000 in personal spending connected to Lila over 6 years, mostly meals, hotel extensions, tickets, and gifts. There was no rent payment, secret loan, second property, or account in her name. The records showed no false project or duplicate reimbursement, so I did not contact his employer. The money mattered in the property process, but it did not explain the system. Paul had not purchased a second life in one reckless transaction. He had built it in the unused edges of trips our marriage already accepted. Over the next 3 weeks, Paul and I communicated in writing about the house and met twice in Carmen's office. He wanted a structured separation without filing while he adjusted medication and decided whether he could continue traveling. I offered 30 days to organize insurance, housing, and medical contacts, but I would not promise an indefinite marriage. Paul said 26 years should carry more weight than the worst 6. I said they did. That was why I had spent 3 weeks checking facts instead of making a decision in Denise's parking lot. But duration could explain grief, it could not create consent retroactively. I filed for divorce on the 24th day. The petition did not mention Parkinson's, Lila, or the directive because none was necessary to turn a private betrayal into a public allegation. It said the marriage was irretrievably broken. That plain phrase covered the actual line Paul had crossed. He had reserved my past as his stable home, given another woman authority over his future, and left me living in a present that only he knew was temporary. Divorce did not make Paul's diagnosis my evidence or my weapon. It became one practical fact among many. He remained competent, employed, and capable of directing his care. His neurologist adjusted medication, and his firm reduced his overnight travel after Paul chose to disclose the condition to human resources. Those decisions belonged to him. I did not call the firm, attend appointments, or request updates from Stephen. When relatives asked why Paul and I were separating so soon after a health diagnosis, I gave one answer: the marriage ended because of a long-term relationship and sustained deception, not because he developed Parkinson's. I did not name Lila or distribute the directive. Most people understood. 2 did not. Paul's cousin told me marriage vows were supposed to matter most when a spouse became vulnerable. I said vows required 2 people to know they were still in the same marriage. Then I ended the conversation. Formal financial disclosure confirmed the preliminary review. Paul had no second residence, hidden business, undisclosed debt, or joint account with Lila. The personal spending was accounted for in settlement negotiations without pretending every restaurant meal could be recovered. Our retirement accounts were divided under the agreement, and each of us kept separate inheritances supported by records. The house became the most difficult asset. Paul wanted to remain because the stairs, neighborhood, and route to his St. Louis doctors were familiar. I initially believed keeping it would allow him to preserve the normal house he had used me to maintain. Carmen asked me to separate symbolism from price. If Paul could refinance, pay my documented equity, and remove my liability by a fixed deadline, the result would be financially sound. If he could not, the house would be listed. He qualified with his salary and a larger down payment from his share of a maturing investment. 11 months after filing, the refinance closed and my name came off the loan and title. I did not surrender the house. I exchanged an asset for its verified value and left Paul responsible for the place he had insisted on keeping unchanged. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the central library. The building had an elevator, a small balcony, and no history that required me to decide which memories were authentic before I set down a chair. Ruth helped me unpack. She did not describe the move as a fresh start every time we opened a box. Some days were fresh and some were simply administrative. Both counted. Lila did not resume contact with me. 6 weeks after the confrontation, Paul's attorney confirmed that Lila had ended the relationship, returned every original document entrusted to her, and deleted the shared care calendar after sending Paul an export. She kept no authority over his treatment. Whether she and Paul spoke privately after that was not a question I needed answered for property, health, or my decision. I accepted the documented boundary, not as a condition of my recovery but as the end of information I needed. Stephen remained Paul's healthcare agent. Paul's attorney confirmed during property disclosure that Lila held no financial authority, and, with Paul's permission, Stephen told me once that he had received the directive and care information he needed. After the divorce, I received no medical reports. That boundary protected Paul's privacy and my exit at the same time. The emotional work was less orderly. For months, I caught myself watching people's hands. A patron signing a library card would flex a stiff thumb, and my mind would jump to all the information a spouse might be hiding. If Ruth canceled dinner because of a headache, I wanted the name of the doctor, the medication, and the exact time it began. I had spent 19 months being told that an accurate observation was anxiety. After the truth, every observation tried to become an emergency. A counselor helped me practice a distinction I used at work but had lost at home: noticing is not the same as knowing, and asking is not the same as controlling. When Ruth's hand shook after too much coffee, I could ask whether she was all right and accept her answer unless new facts gave me reason not to. Trust did not require blindness. It required that both people be allowed to respond to the same reality. Paul and I met in person only 3 times after mediation began. At the last meeting, 14 months after Denise turned her monitor toward us, he looked thinner but steady. He used no cane and needed no help signing. The disease had progressed slowly, as his doctors had expected might happen. He apologized for the affair and for hiding the diagnosis. Then he said something more specific. He had believed he could protect the part of life that was already built by keeping it separate from the part he feared. Instead, he made every ordinary day at home depend on my not knowing what it meant. I told him that was the first explanation he had given that did not call deception protection. It did not change my decision, but it made the apology possible to hear. We signed the final papers. The divorce became effective 6 weeks later. There was no courtroom accusation, public announcement, or sudden collapse of Paul's career. There was a house in his name, an apartment in mine, separate retirement accounts, and a medical future he could no longer assign to someone without asking her to see the entire life around it. My own estate documents had not been updated in 9 years. The old directive named Paul as primary agent and Ruth as alternate. Carmen's closing checklist placed update estate documents near the top, but for several months I left it unchecked because the form felt contaminated by the way I discovered Lila. By then I understood that refusing to plan was still a decision, just one made without useful information. I called Ruth and asked whether she remembered being my alternate. She remembered that I had mentioned it years earlier, but she had never received a copy or heard my actual preferences. At the time, both of us treated alternate as a ceremonial word that meant family would handle things. I had not lied to her or built a second relationship around the document, but I had made the same smaller assumption that the title itself created consent. It did not. Being my sister did not automatically prepare Ruth to authorize treatment, withstand disagreement, or know when I would want comfort instead of another intervention. The discovery did not make my choices equivalent to Paul's. It made the correction more than a reaction to him. If I wanted a different kind of future, I had to build it with information rather than simply replace one name with another. I scheduled an appointment with an estate attorney who had no connection to Paul. Before naming anyone, I invited Ruth to my apartment and asked whether she was willing to discuss the role. She did not answer yes immediately. She asked what mattered to me if I could not speak, how I felt about prolonged ventilation, who should receive updates, and whether I expected her to manage finances too. We spent 2 hours on questions Paul had hidden inside a sealed envelope. I told her I wanted comfort prioritized when recovery was no longer reasonably expected, that my financial power of attorney would remain separate, and that my longtime friend Nina would be backup because she lived nearby. Ruth said she could accept the medical role with those limits. Nina agreed after reading the same information. At the attorney's office, I signed a directive naming Ruth primary and Nina alternate. The document itself was ordinary. The difference was what happened before and after the signature. Both women knew they were named. Both had copies. Either could withdraw. My physician received one, and I placed another in a red folder on the shelf beside my insurance information. I did not seal a letter for some future emergency to explain a present choice. On Sunday, Ruth came over to help mount shelves on the balcony wall. She pointed to the red folder and asked whether that was the one we had discussed. I said yes. She knew where it was, what it meant, and what it did not ask her to carry. Then we went outside, argued about whether the shelves were level, and laughed when we discovered the balcony floor sloped toward the drain. Nothing about the afternoon looked important enough to place in an estate summary. That was what made it matter. For 26 years, I had assumed marriage itself guaranteed that Paul and I would face the same future. The name on Denise's screen taught me that a shared future exists only when the people inside it are given the truth and allowed to say yes. My new directive named Ruth, but the page was not the promise. The promise was that she knew, she understood, she had chosen, and there was no hidden life required to make her stay.